Finland's inventory of armored vehicles during World War II was one of the most diverse in that it included machinery of various roles and capabilities from the Soviet Union, Germany, Britain, France, and Finland itself. Without a robust domestic tank industry of their own, Finland relied on imported and captured vehicles to varying degrees of success, proving the resolve and resourcefulness of the Finns in times of war. Most of the tanks used by Finland originated in the USSR. In this video, we'll summarize the multitude of these designs. The second part of this series will focus on imported tanks from Britain, Germany, Sweden, and France. To provide some context, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939. According to the document, both sides agreed to not attack one another, and they divided Eastern Europe into two separate zones of influence. Finland fit squarely into the Soviet zone of influence, and Stalin ordered preparations for an assault on the country. Principally, it was Stalin's goal to take away from Finland many of their lands near the critically important city of Leningrad, which, according to Stalin, was vulnerable to invasion. Not only this, but the Soviets argued that they had historical claims to Finnish territory, which used to be entirely controlled by the Russian Empire before Finland became independent in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution. Therefore, Soviet commanders ordered their forces to cross the Finnish frontier on November 30th, 1939, marking the beginning of the Winter War. Entirely contrary to Soviet expectations, only very small advances were made. The Soviets used thousands of tanks, mostly the light T-26 and BT series, yet they could not break all of the Finnish defenses. In fact, Soviet recklessness enabled Finland to capture many Soviet tanks, which they repurposed for their own army. The Winter War ended in March of 1940, but Finland found itself at war again just over a year later, when the country participated in Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. During the fighting in the Northern Front in 1941, Finland mostly encountered old models of Soviet light and medium tanks that they had gained familiarity fighting against during the Winter War. In later months and years, the Finns started to encounter modern medium and heavy Soviet tanks. The Soviet T-26 was by far the most numerous tank in the Finnish army, with a total of 114 captured during the Winter War and Continuation War between 1939 and 1944. Given that Finland had a very small domestic tank industry, all captured vehicles were of interest to Finland. They used captured T-26s mostly in the Continuation War, and they fared relatively well against opposing Soviet light tanks, as the Soviets had deployed most of their medium tanks against the German front instead. However, the Finns considered the optics and radio to be subpar, and the engine faced reliability issues in the cold weather. Interestingly, the Finns also captured a number of T-26 Flame tank variants, but they were not used due to shortages of fuel for the flamethrower. Finland used the tanks until the end of the war, with their last action occurring during the Lapland War from September 1944 to May 1945, in which Finland expelled German soldiers from the northern part of their country after signing an armistice with the Soviet Union. Finland captured a total of 7 T-28 Soviet medium tanks from 1939 to 1944, and they were incorporated into the heavy tank platoon. Even though the Soviets and other major powers would classify the T-28 as a medium tank, the Finns considered it a heavy tank due to its tonnage and armor compared to other captured vehicles. The experiences of Finnish crews with this tank was rarely positive, as it was difficult to drive and made for a sizable target. The Finns added extra armor to the front of the turret, which was a useful addition but substantially reduced the speed. None of the 7 tanks were lost due to combat, and in fact they actually survived a number of hits. Instead, mechanical issues plagued them, and they often had to be taken out of combat for lengthy repairs. Despite their obsolescence, they remained in Finnish service until 1951. With a 45mm cannon, 37mm of armor on the front, sides, and turret, and a max speed of 60 km per hour. The T-50 made for a decent, versatile light tank. The Finns captured a single T-50 in 1941 and added extra 14mm armored plates to the front hull and sides of the turret. It remained operational until it suffered mechanical failure in June 1944. The T-37A and the T-38 were Soviet amphibious scout tanks, with the 38 being a later development of the 37A. The Finns captured a couple dozen of these tanks, but did not consider them effective. They were armed with only a 7.62mm machine gun, and the 9mm armor was only effective at stopping small arms fire. Being designed in the early 1930s, these tanks were undoubtedly obsolete by 1940 and after, and they often got bogged down in the rough Finnish terrain. In the early and mid-1930s, the USSR developed a series of BT light tanks, which were extraordinarily fast and had similar armor protection to the T-26 and used the same 45mm cannon. The Soviets used the BT-5 and BT-7 extensively during the Winter War, but despite this, the Finns did not manage to capture any intact. Most were destroyed by Finnish anti-tank guns or Molotov cocktails, and the abandoned ones that were left behind were often too difficult to retrieve due to the rough terrain and Finland's lack of heavy towing equipment. By 1944, Finland had captured roughly 120 BT tanks during the Continuation War in various states of repair, but none were actually used in combat. This was because the engines consumed lots of fuel, which Finland was running a deficit of, and their high speeds could not be exploited in the dense Finnish terrain. Their tracks were weak and often fell off on sharp turns or when moving over uneven terrain as well. However, 18 of the highest quality BT-7 hulls were used for the BT-42 Finnish assault gun in 1942. Most of the remaining BT tanks had their turrets removed for use as stationary turret bunkers. They were placed along the Salpa line, Finland's last line of defense against the Soviets, but thankfully for the Finns, the Soviets never advanced that far before the armistice. The Soviets used T-34s and other medium and heavy tanks less frequently against Finland due to more pressing needs on the German front, but the Finns nonetheless faced a substantial number, especially in the Karelian Isthmus near Leningrad. The Finns captured two variants of the T-34, the T-34-76 and the T-34-85. First, regarding the 76 version, they captured 4 from the Soviets in 1941 and bought 3 captured ones from Germany in 1944. The Finns were initially caught off guard and had no experience operating or fighting the T-34 before the Continuation War, as none had been used during the Winter War. The Finns desperately needed equipment capable of destroying the T-34, and its 37mm and 45mm anti-tank guns could not penetrate its armor and could only rarely disable the tracks. Therefore, the T-34-76s in Finnish service proved incredibly valuable as a weapon capable of destroying medium and heavy Soviet tanks, as well as deflecting fire from Soviet light tanks and small arms fire. With up to 52mm of armor, a powerful 76mm gun, a smooth Christie suspension, and a reliable 500 horsepower engine, the T-34-76 proved to be a considerable improvement to tanks in Finnish service. The Finnish T-34-76 saw the most fierce combat during the Battle of Tali-Ihantala in the summer of 1944, in which they disabled numerous Soviet tanks and lost no T-34s of their own. During the Battle of Tali-Ihantala, the Finns captured and used 7 T-34-85 variants, the most produced Soviet tank of the war, and one which used a larger 85mm cannon. The Soviets created this version in 1943 in response to heavier German tanks, such as the Tiger and Panther. With 125mm of armor penetration at a 500-meter range, the Finns found captured T-34-85s to be exceptionally useful against the heaviest of Soviet armor. 75 millimeters of 60-degree sloped frontal armor also proved excellent defense against anti-tank weaponry. Despite being one of the most advanced tanks in their arsenal, the Finns employed the T-34-85s in only a limited manner for the rest of the Continuation War and Lapland War due to shortages of captured ammunition for the 85mm gun. In 1941, the Soviets left behind a sizable amount of heavy equipment as they retreated from the Finnish and German advance. The Finns captured numerous KV-1 heavy tanks from the Soviets and repaired 2 of them for service by 1942. One of these was the 1940 KV-1E variant, which had extra bolted side armor plates. The other was a KV-1 model 1942 with an impressive 130mm of frontal armor. The armor on these KV-1s remained relevant against Soviet and German tanks until the end of the war in 1945, yet the tanks suffered in other aspects. For one, the Finns lacked spare parts for the KV-1, making repairs time-consuming and subpar. In addition, visibility for the crew was suboptimal, and gas consumption was high relative to other Soviet tanks. The Soviet 76mm gun, while suitable for 1942 standards, struggled to deal with heavier Soviet tanks by 1944. They served in the Continuation War and Lapland War, and in October 1944, they were relegated to training roles. During the Battle of Tali-Ihantala in June 1944, the Finns captured 2 massive 46-ton ISU-152 Soviet self-propelled guns with potent armor and firepower. One was captured intact but lost in battle 4 days later against Soviet T-34s. The other had been captured with moderate damage, rendering it unfit for combat, and the Finns did not have the technical capacity to repair it. The BT-42 was an assault gun project that would not be possible without the interactions between Finland, the Soviet Union, and Britain. Namely, it was developed as a combination of Finnish ingenuity, captured Soviet tanks, and imported British weaponry. The story of the BT-42 begins in late 1939 during the Winter War, in which the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Finland. Finland captured a plethora of Soviet BT-7 tanks during this war, which would be the basis for the new Finnish assault gun. Moving forward to 1942, the Soviets began deploying vehicles such as the T-34, which had been the product of many advancements in armored technology, and Finland struggled to combat their heavier armor. By this point, Finland still lacked a domestic tank industry of its own, and instead relied on repurposing captured vehicles and imports of Stug 3s from Germany. The Stug 3s were excellent assault guns, yet Finland sought a greater quantity of tanks to reinforce their confidence in taking on Russian armor. As a desperate measure to gain access to more tanks, Finland began heavily modifying the aging Soviet light tanks that they had captured, such as the BT-7. By 1942, these light tanks were obsolete, and they had very little use except to be modified. Also relevant is the fact that Britain had exported numerous QF 4.5-inch howitzers to Finland during the Winter War. With this in mind, a number of Finnish commanders suggested equipping the BT-7 tanks with the 4.5-inch howitzers to gain the firepower to take down Soviet tanks. This was to replace the aging 45mm anti-tank gun originally found on the BT-7, which could penetrate light tanks but was incapable of reliably neutralizing T-34s or other medium and heavy tanks. Additionally, although the BT-7 used substandard armament, they had a whopping 500 horsepower engine that was capable of supporting a much heavier turret. The Finnish State Artillery Factory was assigned to design and assemble an assault gun for use in the Continuation War. The Finns had little experience in repairing vehicles, and no experience with manufacturing or modifying existing tanks. In fact, their only other experience with armor was producing armored police cars in the 1930s. The combination of the BT-7 chassis and the 114mm howitzer was naturally flawed from its very concept, regardless of how little experience the Finns had. A narrow hull and crew arrangement of BT-7s meant that installing a gun to the hull of the tank was out of the question. The only choice was to construct a new turret to house the howitzer, and this resulted in a 15-ton assault gun with a high profile and disproportionately heavy recoil. The BT-42 was heavier than what the original BT-7 suspension was intended for, causing problems. In addition, extra weight compounded with the narrow tracks of the BT-7 made off-road driving very difficult, which was a critical concern considering that most of the fighting in Finland took place in rural, forested, and hilly areas on poor roads. The three-man crew consisted of a gunner, loader, and driver. There was no secondary armament on the tank, but the crew were given a Suomi M31 submachine gun, which could be fired out of the ports or cupola. Of course, this was much less useful than a machine gun included on the turret, but the sheer size of the howitzer left no space for it. Given the firepower behind the gun, it had a very slow reload due to the projectile and cartridge needing to be reloaded separately. Not only this, but a cramped turret, poor optics, low muzzle velocity, and the reliance on an arduous hand crank further reduced its effectiveness. 16 mm of armor protected the turret, and the large number of rivets used to hold the turret together could become loose if hit even by small arms fire and end up as dangerous shrapnel inside the vehicle. Given that there was a 7-year gap between the development of the BT-7 and BT-42, the Finns had the opportunity to make numerous upgrades to the radio, optics, and mudguards. A total of 18 BT-42s were manufactured, and they began arriving on the front in early 1943, which was later than anticipated because repairing captured Soviet tanks had a higher priority than producing the BT-42. First seeing action in East Karelia along the Svir River in early 1943, the BT-42 was not suited to perform its intended role of an assault gun due to inadequate anti-tank ammunition and low muzzle velocity. Instead, it performed best when firing from a stationary position at static enemy defenses, such as bunkers and machine gun nests. Seeing these issues, Finland ordered 30 Stug 3G assault guns from Germany to fulfill the role of tank destroyers instead. The BT-42 saw its most intense fighting during the Soviet Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive in the summer of 1944, in which its greatest flaws were revealed. The Finns deployed BT-42s to defend the city of Viipuri, but a lack of understanding between tanks, assault guns, and self-propelled artillery led to ineffective use of the BT-42s. Namely, they were still used in the role of tank destroyers even though their armament was unable to destroy enemy tanks. In response to this, lower-ranking commanders in charge of BT-42s, having more tactical knowledge of their use, requested headquarters permission to withdraw the vehicles to northern Viipuri in order to provide fire support from there. However, HQ refused and wanted BT-42s fighting in close-quarters combat inside Viipuri. This only further revealed the shortcomings of the BT-42 as a tank destroyer. Even at 70 meters range, the heat shells could not damage Soviet T-34s or heavy tanks. Indeed, as a testament to their subpar performance, a KV-1 took 18 direct hits without any damage. Besides the inadequate performance of the armament, the BT-42 suffered from technical issues. During the Soviet Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive in June 1944, 8 BT-42s were destroyed, mostly due to mechanical failures. Following their disappointing performance during the Soviet summer offensive, the remaining 10 BT-42s were declared obsolete and withdrawn from service. 9 were scrapped, and 1 remains on display at the Perola Armor Museum in Finland. By mid-1944, imports of German tanks and assault guns replaced the lackluster BT-42. Due to industrial limitations, Finland relied on captured Soviet tanks for a large portion of its tank arsenal. Although Finland lacked expertise and spare parts for many of the vehicles, they nonetheless played an important role in Finland's war effort, especially the captured Soviet medium and heavy tanks, many of which survived the war.